It's hard to exaggerate how surreal this moment feels. For years, the Chicago skyline carried a monument that wasn't just steel and glass, it was branding. A 98-story declaration of survival, a comeback story cast in concrete. Donald Trump didn't simply own that tower, he wove it into his mythology. It was the physical proof that after the 2008 financial crisis nearly crushed him, he stood back up taller than ever. And now, in this unfolding legal drama, that symbol sits at the center of a high-stakes enforcement battle that cuts far deeper than real estate. Let's slow this down and strip away the noise. A civil fraud judgment isn't political theater. It isn't a cable news segment. It's a court order with numbers attached. When a defendant loses and owes hundreds of millions of dollars, the system doesn't run on speeches, it runs on procedure. If the bond isn't secured to pause enforcement during appeal, the creditor can pursue assets. That principle applies to ordinary citizens. It also applies to former presidents. That's where the Chicago Tower becomes more than architecture. For Trump, it represented resilience. When the global financial crisis hit, critics predicted bankruptcy. Banks tightened credit. Analysts doubted his empire. But finishing that skyscraper allowed him to reshape the narrative. I don't fall, I rise. The gleaming facade, the luxury hotel floors, the giant name mounted across the riverfront, it all became visual shorthand for dominance. The brand message was simple: wealth equals power, and power equals immunity. Trump's legal strategy, consistent with his past approach, centers on delay and defiance, emergency motions, aggressive rhetoric, public attacks on prosecutors. The familiar pattern: frame enforcement as political persecution, mobilize supporters, and turn legal exposure into fundraising fuel. That strategy works in media cycles. It does not alter arithmetic. The Chicago property in this scenario becomes the pressure valve, not because it's the only asset, but because it is one of the most visible. A skyscraper with your name in massive letters is not subtle collateral. It's a trophy. And when trophies enter the enforcement process, the symbolism is unavoidable. This is where political reality collides with psychological reality. Trump's political identity depends on the perception of perpetual victory. The deal maker, the winner, the man who always outmaneuvers opponents. But watching a signature asset move under court supervision challenges that image in a way indictments alone do not. Supporters may tolerate accusations, they may tolerate investigations, they may even tolerate trials, but visible asset loss strikes at the core narrative of invincibility. At the same time, moderate Republican donors and strategists begin running uncomfortable projections. Campaigns require liquidity. Campaigns require focus. If financial defense consumes both cash and attention, operational capacity weakens. Legal chaos may energize a base, but it unsettles swing voters and institutional backers who prize stability. And here's the structural tension. Paying voluntarily looks like surrender. Fighting publicly looks desperate. Both options carry reputational cost. That's the bind. Meanwhile, the broader conversation about accountability for white-collar fraud intensifies. The court's finding, That financial statements were materially inflated over years reframes the situation from partisan dispute to systemic enforcement. For critics, it signals long-delayed consequences. For supporters, it reinforces claims of selective targeting. For institutions, it simply activates compliance protocols. And compliance protocols don't argue, they execute. The Chicago Tower was once proof that the comeback story worked. Now, in this restructured narrative, it becomes a test of whether court judgments against powerful figures carry real teeth, or whether wealth can indefinitely outmaneuver enforcement. This isn't just about one building. It's about whether legal consequences function the same at the top as they do everywhere else. And that question, unlike campaign slogans, can't be shouted away. To understand why this moment carries so much weight, you have to look beyond the headlines and into how enforcement actually works. When a civil fraud judgment is issued at this scale, the system doesn't pause for political sensitivity. It moves through a checklist. If the defendant wants to delay enforcement while appealing, they post a bond, essentially a financial guarantee that the money will be there if the appeal fails. No bond, no pause. It's not personal, it's procedural. And that's where the situation becomes complicated. Posting a bond of this magnitude requires either massive liquid reserves or lenders willing to stake their capital on your stability. But when a court has already determined that your financial statements were materially inflated, lenders don't just review numbers, they review credibility. Risk committees get involved. Internal memos circulate. Exposure limits tighten. That's how pressure builds quietly. At first, Trump's response followed a familiar script: attack the legitimacy of the case, question the motives of the prosecutor, frame the ruling as election interference. In political terms, it was effective. Fundraising appeals surged. Supporters interpreted the judgment as proof of a biased system. The narrative of persecution activated instantly. But legal enforcement doesn't depend on polling. While campaign rallies amplified defiance, the clock kept ticking. Interest continued accruing daily. Legal bills mounted across multiple cases. The total financial exposure expanded in real time, and the longer enforcement dragged on, the narrower the options became. There's another layer here: liquidity versus valuation. A property might be valued at hundreds of millions on paper, but paper value doesn't pay judgments. Liquid capital does. If assets are tied up in complex structures, heavily leveraged, or exposed to market fluctuations, converting them into cash quickly becomes messy. The larger the property, the harder the sale, especially when buyers know the seller is under legal pressure. Distressed sales rarely fetch premium prices. That's why this isn't simply about a single skyscraper. It's about leverage. Once one high-profile asset becomes subject to enforcement, every other asset becomes part of the same equation. Lenders reassess collateral, partners revisit agreements, insurance carriers reevaluate policies. It creates a domino effect that ripples outward. And here's where politics intersects with psychology again. Trump's brand has always relied on projection. Success displayed boldly. Towers with giant letters. Resorts with gold-plated interiors. Visual dominance reinforces narrative dominance. But when the legal system intervenes, the imagery shifts. The same building that once symbolized triumph now symbolizes vulnerability. That shift matters more than many realize. Campaign donors, particularly major ones, don't operate on emotion. They operate on probability. They ask 3 questions. 1. Can this candidate win? 2. Can this candidate govern? 3. Is this candidate stable enough to protect our investment? When headlines shift from policy to asset seizure, confidence erodes. Even loyal backers start hedging. Contributions slow, commitments soften, public endorsements become more cautious. And then there are swing voters, independent voters, suburban moderates, and business-minded conservatives often care less about partisan loyalty and more about competence. Watching a presidential candidate manage mounting legal exposure and asset enforcement raises uncomfortable doubts about management capability. It's not about ideology at that point, it's about operational control. Meanwhile, Trump faces a strategic dilemma with no clean exit. Option 1. Fight every enforcement action aggressively, file motions, appeal aggressively, delay wherever possible. The upside? Maintain the narrative of defiance. The downside? Burn through more capital while interest compounds and legal losses stack publicly. Option 2. Liquidate assets voluntarily to satisfy the judgment. The upside? Regain financial clarity. The downside? Appear defeated to a base that prizes dominance. Neither path preserves the mythology intact. That mythology, the perpetual winner, the unbeatable negotiator, is central to Trump's political identity. Losing symbolic assets challenges that identity more forcefully than courtroom arguments ever could. And here's the broader implication. If a judgment of this scale can be enforced against someone of this stature, it resets expectations. It signals that corporate structuring, interstate transfers, and political visibility do not override court authority. For some observers, that reinforces faith in the rule of law. For others, it confirms fears of institutional overreach. But either way, it establishes precedent. Because if enforcement stalls or collapses under political pressure, it sends a different message entirely. That the wealthy can indefinitely outlast consequences through complexity and visibility. That's why this moment feels larger than one man or one building. It's about whether legal accountability scales upward. The Chicago Tower may be the most visible piece, but it's not the only one. Other high-profile properties sit under scrutiny. Additional enforcement actions remain possible. The legal process doesn't end with one transfer of ownership. It continues until the judgment is satisfied. And all of this unfolds while Trump campaigns nationally. That dual track, presidential campaign and financial enforcement, creates unprecedented optics. Voters watch rallies in one frame and court filings in another. The contrast becomes impossible to ignore. One narrative promises strength and restoration. The other documents debt and judicial authority. Eventually, those narratives collide. Now here's where this story moves beyond real estate and into something much larger, the political shockwave. Because once a high-profile asset like the Chicago Tower becomes subject to enforcement, the impact doesn't stop at Trump's balance sheet. It spreads outward into the Republican Party, donor networks, and the broader perception of leadership stability. Behind closed doors, conversations shift. Republican strategists are forced into uncomfortable calculations. Publicly, many remain loyal. Privately, the question changes from, can he win, to, can he survive? There's a difference. Winning an election requires momentum. Surviving financial enforcement requires resilience, liquidity, focus, legal bandwidth, and those are finite resources. Major donors aren't emotional activists, they're risk managers. When someone carries multiple criminal indictments, massive civil judgments, mounting legal expenses, active asset enforcement, that's not just political controversy, that's systemic exposure. Even if Trump retains strong grassroots enthusiasm, campaigns at the presidential level depend heavily on large checks, super PAC support, and institutional coordination. If donors start hesitating, not out of ideology but out of uncertainty, campaign infrastructure weakens quietly. Campaigns don't collapse dramatically, they starve gradually. Then there's the psychological component. Trump's political power has always been tied to dominance. He doesn't frame himself as a participant in the system, he frames himself as someone who controls it. That image works when opponents are on defense. It works when investigations stall. It works when negotiations favor him. But court-ordered enforcement reverses the dynamic. Instead of being the aggressor, he becomes the respondent. Instead of dictating terms, he reacts to filings. Instead of projecting victory, he addresses loss. That inversion changes perception, and perception is everything in politics. Swing voters, especially suburban and independent blocs, tend to prioritize stability. They may tolerate controversy, they may even tolerate sharp rhetoric, but visible financial unraveling triggers a deeper doubt. If he can't stabilize his own business empire, can he stabilize the country? Democrats will lean heavily into that framing. Expect messaging built around three themes. 1. Accountability. No one is above the law. 2. Competence. Financial fraud has consequences. 3. Stability. Governance over chaos. Footage of court filings, visuals of seized properties, statements from judges emphasizing due process. The narrative becomes simple and potent. This isn't persecution, it's enforcement. That line resonates beyond party lines. Now consider the alternative scenario. What if Trump had successfully blocked enforcement? If courts had allowed endless delays? If asset transfers shielded properties indefinitely? If appeals froze the process for years? That would have established a very different precedent. It would signal that extreme wealth plus legal complexity equals immunity. And that precedent wouldn't just apply to Trump. It would apply to every billionaire facing civil fraud exposure in the future. It would normalize the strategy of infinite delay, move assets, restructure ownership, exhaust the court system. The stakes extend far beyond one political career. There's another factor at play here: institutional confidence. The American civil system depends on enforceability. When someone loses a lawsuit and refuses to pay, courts must have mechanisms to compel compliance. Otherwise, judgments become symbolic. For ordinary citizens, enforcement is swift. Homes are foreclosed, wages are garnished, bank accounts are frozen. If high-profile defendants operate under a different reality, public faith erodes. This case tests that boundary. And then there's Warren Buffett's reaction, understated but telling. Buffett rarely comments on political figures directly. His reputation is built on disciplined capital allocation, transparent accounting, and long-term credibility. When asked about the situation, he didn't attack Trump personally. He framed it in structural terms. If valuations are inflated and statements unreliable, eventually the correction arrives. That's not political rhetoric, that's financial gravity. Buffett represents a philosophy opposite to Trump's style: conservative leverage, conservative claims. Avoid unnecessary legal exposure. Preserve trust with lenders. His quiet commentary carries weight precisely because it's unemotional. The contrast between the two business models, hype versus accounting discipline, becomes symbolic. Now step back. We're watching a presidential campaign intersect with a major civil enforcement action. That combination has never unfolded quite like this before. Historically, former presidents enjoyed a kind of institutional insulation. Legal disputes existed, but not at this magnitude, not mid-campaign, not with active asset seizure. This moment feels unprecedented because it is. It forces a deeper question. Can someone maintain political viability while their financial empire undergoes judicial dismantling? Or does visible enforcement reshape the narrative irreversibly? So far, Trump's base remains loyal. Fundraising spikes when he frames actions as persecution. That dynamic shouldn't be underestimated. But national elections aren't won solely with base voters. They're won with coalitions. And coalitions require confidence. Confidence in stability, confidence in competence, confidence in viability. As enforcement continues, each new filing chips at that confidence. This isn't a dramatic collapse. It's structural pressure, and structural pressure changes outcomes over time. Now let's move beyond headlines and into the structural consequences. Because the seizure of a single high-profile property, even one as iconic as the Chicago Skyscraper, isn't the end game. It's a mechanism. And once that mechanism activates, it doesn't simply stop at one address. Civil judgment enforcement works like a tightening vice. If the proceeds from one asset don't fully satisfy the debt, enforcement expands. Additional properties are evaluated. Equity positions are assessed. Corporate ownership layers are scrutinized. Receivership becomes a tool. Cross-state enforcement filings multiply. And here's the uncomfortable reality. Large real estate portfolios often appear massive on paper, but their liquidity is limited. Skyscrapers aren't checking accounts. Golf resorts aren't money market funds. Hotels don't convert to cash overnight without heavy discounts. That matters enormously. When a property enters forced sale conditions, market dynamics shift immediately. Buyers know the seller isn't negotiating from strength. They price in urgency. They price in legal complexity. They price in reputational risk. Forced sales rarely capture peak valuation. So even if a tower is appraised at $850 million, actual sale proceeds may land significantly lower depending on debt encumbrances, operating conditions, and buyer leverage, which means enforcement may not end with one sale. That's where the real long-term risk lies. Because if liquidation spreads across multiple properties, the empire doesn't just shrink financially, it shrinks symbolically. And Trump's brand is deeply symbolic. He didn't build political power through quiet boardroom influence. He built it through spectacle. Towers with his name in 20-foot letters, hotels with gold-plated interiors, golf courses marketed as elite sanctuaries. Remove assets and you reduce spectacle. Reduce spectacle and you reduce the aura of untouchable success. Now let's examine another dimension. Credit. Real estate empires rely on credit relationships. Banks extend lines based on asset stability and borrower reputation. If a borrower is under active enforcement and high-value properties are being seized, lenders tighten. Not because of politics, because of exposure. Credit committees don't ask whether someone is popular. They ask whether collateral is stable and whether legal risk is contained. Once enforcement becomes active, every loan tied to those assets is reevaluated. That means refinancing becomes harder. New leverage becomes more expensive. Bridge financing becomes scarce. This is how leverage-based empires contract. Then comes the reputational echo. Partners, developers, licensees, hotel operators often include morality or reputational clauses in contracts. If association creates risk, termination becomes an option. Even without formal clauses, market pressure shifts behavior. Developers ask, will associating with this brand attract lawsuits? Will lenders hesitate? Will international investors avoid the project? When those questions surface, brand licensing revenue declines quietly. And remember, Trump's empire is partly a licensing model. Not every building with his name is owned by him outright. Many are brand partnerships. If the brand becomes legally radioactive, that revenue stream weakens. This is where politics re-enters the frame. Running for president requires stability. Not perfection, but stability. Donors want to know their investment won't be overshadowed by escalating court crises. Staff want to know operations won't be constantly derailed by emergency legal responses. Imagine preparing for a debate while simultaneously fighting property seizure hearings. Imagine planning national campaign stops while negotiating asset liquidation timelines. Focus fragments. And fragmented focus weakens discipline. Then there's the independent voter effect. Poll after poll shows that while partisan bases remain entrenched, independents shift based on perceived competence. They're not always deeply ideological. They're risk-sensitive. If the narrative crystallizes into financial chaos, that sticks. Voters may forgive sharp rhetoric. They may forgive controversial statements. But financial instability reads differently. It suggests unpredictability. And unpredictability is electoral kryptonite in swing states. Now zoom out further. This situation tests something larger than one man's career. It tests whether high-profile civil fraud judgments can actually be enforced against powerful figures. If enforcement proceeds methodically and survives appeal, it reinforces a principle. Judgments mean something. If enforcement collapses under political pressure or legal maneuvering, it sends the opposite message. Wealth plus influence equals flexibility. That's a consequential precedent. It affects future white-collar prosecutions. It affects regulatory credibility. It affects investor trust in financial statements nationwide. Markets don't just price individual companies, they price legal systems. Confidence in enforcement stability underpins everything from bond markets to international investment flows. And finally, there's the identity question. Trump has long portrayed himself as someone who bends systems, someone who outmaneuvers courts, renegotiates debts, restructures liabilities, and emerges stronger. If this enforcement wave continues without reversal, it challenges that narrative at its core. It suggests the system, in this instance, didn't bend, it held. And if that perception hardens, it changes not just this election cycle, but Trump's long-term political mythology. Now we arrive at the part that actually determines whether this is turbulence or structural contraction. Because enforcement actions create headlines, appeals determine endurance. Trump's legal team is betting heavily on the appellate process. The strategy is familiar: challenge the valuation findings, question judicial discretion, argue excessive penalties, frame enforcement as disproportionate. Appeals can slow momentum. They can modify damages. In rare cases, they can overturn key findings. But appeals do not automatically stop enforcement, especially when bond requirements aren't met. And that distinction is critical. To pause collection during appeal, defendants typically must secure a bond covering the judgment. That bond protects the creditor in case the appeal fails. If you can't post it, enforcement continues. And securing a bond at this magnitude is no small feat. Bonding companies require collateral. Banks require stability. Insurers require confidence that repayment capacity exists. When assets are already under threat, underwriting becomes cautious, which leads to the unspoken scenario people are whispering about: bankruptcy. Not personal Chapter 7 collapse, that's unlikely in the immediate sense, but strategic restructuring filings, corporate protection mechanisms, asset partitioning to shield portions of the portfolio. Those conversations tend to happen quietly before they happen publicly. Bankruptcy, however, carries its own reputational gravity. Trump has historically used bankruptcy strategically in corporate contexts: casinos, real estate projects, restructurings. But doing so while running for president under fraud judgment enforcement would amplify the instability narrative dramatically. It would confirm financial distress, and optics matter. Now let's examine the electoral map implications. If enforcement drags into primary season, the base remains largely immovable. Trump's core voters interpret legal pressure as proof of persecution. Fundraising spikes after every major court development. But the general election is different terrain. In battleground states, Arizona, Georgia, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, elections are decided by margins under 2 to 3%. Independent voters and suburban moderates become decisive. For these voters, the question won't be, do I like Trump? It will be, is this chaos worth it? If campaign messaging is constantly interrupted by legal emergencies, asset seizures, court rulings, and financial instability stories, Democrats will frame the race as a referendum on competence. And competence messaging plays differently than grievance messaging. Democrats will argue, you can't negotiate global trade if you're negotiating asset seizures. You can't restore economic confidence if your own financial statements were ruled fraudulent. You can't stabilize the country while your business empire is destabilizing. That line of attack is simple and powerful. Now let's return to Warren Buffett's subtle intervention, because it speaks to something deeper than politics. Buffett's worldview is rooted in durability. He avoids excessive leverage. He avoids opaque accounting. He avoids reputational volatility. His comment about inflated valuations eventually collapsing isn't a partisan jab, it's a principle. Markets forgive risk. They don't forgive misrepresentation. If financial statements stretch beyond reality long enough, the correction is inevitable. And that correction, when it comes, rarely announces itself dramatically. It unfolds methodically, asset by asset, filing by filing. Which brings us to the final structural question: is this reversible? There are 3 possible paths. 1. Appeal reduction scenario. If appellate courts reduce the penalty significantly, Trump regains financial breathing room. Asset sales may still occur, but at a controlled pace. The narrative shifts from collapse to overreach corrected. 2. Partial liquidation stabilization. Several properties are sold, judgment satisfied, empire shrinks but survives. Trump campaigns as a fighter who paid the price and moved forward. 3. Cascading enforcement spiral. Appeals fail, additional assets enter receivership, credit tightens further, licensing revenue declines, donor hesitation grows, the empire contracts permanently. Which path unfolds depends on judicial timelines, market sale outcomes, and liquidity capacity. But here's the deeper takeaway. This isn't just about one skyscraper. It's about whether the American civil enforcement system functions identically for powerful figures and ordinary citizens. If judgments can be enforced across state lines, if assets can be seized regardless of political position, if appeals cannot indefinitely shield liability, then the system reinforces its own legitimacy. If not, then it signals flexibility at the top. Either way, this moment becomes precedent. Trump's brand has always been built on spectacle. Towering buildings, dominant language, the image of unshakable control. But legal enforcement doesn't operate in spectacle. It operates in paperwork, in court orders, in receiverships, in auction notices, and paperwork outlasts headlines. We are watching whether a narrative of invincibility can survive a mechanism built specifically to test it. Because in the end, this isn't about whether Trump keeps a building. It's about whether financial gravity applies equally at the highest level. And gravity, historically, doesn't negotiate.